Okay, colleagues, greetings and welcome back. Εντάξει, συνάδελφοι, γεια σας και καλημέρα. So, we're going to continue our reading of the wonderful article by Adrian Johnston on Jacques Lacan. Thank you very much, colleagues, on joining me on this journey. It's not the easiest text, not the easiest reading, but this is important work in progress for me. Again, hopefully, by the end of this reading, I actually have another article in mind. Hopefully, I'll get around to doing a proper lecture on Lacan, but in some sense, you get to see my work process, my workflow, right? It's a little bit more messy, but also maybe a little bit more raw. Reminds me of some of the seminars we used to have with students. Some people on YouTube told me that I'm not trying to make any particular claims for myself, but some people said they wanted to see what my classes are like. Well, here you get a glimpse. Let's hope this is an educational experience. Anyway, we would actually do this from time to time with students. Get some texts and read them aloud like this. Anyway, so. In the previous section, we talked about the imaginary, the real, and the symbolic. And in this section, we talk about the mirror stage, which is, a very important concept of Lacan. So without further ado, let's jump right into it. So the account of the mirror stage, perhaps Lacan's most famous theoretical contribution, maybe even more famous than the well-known thesis, apropos the unconscious as structured like a language, complicated, idea that we talked about a little bit. The word structured, I feel, does most of the work in the sentence. Anyway, so initially developed in the 1930s, this account of the mirror stage, right, involves a number of interrelated ingredients. Lacan offers the narrative of this stage as an explanation specifically for the genesis and function of the Freudian psychical agency of the ego, ich in German or moi in French. One of the psychoanalytic and philosophical upshots of the mirror stage, a crucial one in Lacan's eyes, is that the ego is an object rather than a subject. An ego is an object rather than a subject. So in philosophical terms, I think here the word subject emphasizes passivity, whereas object emphasizes, so obviously subject is activity and object is passivity. So an object is something that is acted upon, whereas the subject is the one who does the acting. So maybe activity, agency, right? And the object, the idea being that, again, human beings are products. So an object is a product of of certain underlying forces, yes. Anyway, in other words, the ego, despite conscious senses to the contrary, is not a locus of autonomous agency, the seat of a free, true I, determining its own fate. So no, the ego is not the locus of autonomous agency and is not a seat of a free, true I determining its own fate. This portrait of ego as object is at the heart of Lacan's lifelong critical polemics against Anglo-American ego psychology. So Lacan's polemics against Anglo-American ego psychology, with the ego psychologists seeking to strengthen their patients' egos by appealing to the supposed autonomous and conflict-free sides of these psychical agencies. Against this, Lacan views the ego as thoroughly compromised and inherently neurotic to its very core, as a passionate defense of the constitutive ignorance of the unconscious. So basically, again, to oversimplify, ego is not the subject, and ego is an imaginary illusion. And when I say imaginary, I mean imaginary in Lacanian sense. Although the symbolic also plays a part in constitution of the ego, as far as I can tell. So basically, what human beings identify with is not a real self, but is a kind of false illusory self. So this kind of, let's write this, false illusory self. Maybe compare this to Rousseau's amour propre, if you're familiar with this terminology, or maybe compare in general to Marx's notion of ideology. Obviously, Nietzsche would have a lot to say about this as well. Anyway, so I mean, in general, this is part of this broad context of critique of the bourgeoisie and of the bourgeois lifestyle, of the bourgeois self-understanding, and kind of more broadly this critique, which I find extremely important. So this is Lacan versus kind of the bourgeois freedom, kind of bourgeois self-conception, self-conceited, imaginary, illusory freedom. This is Lacan versus Descartes, and also Lacan versus certain popular notions of Christianity. So popular Christianity. I say popular Christianity because as a philosopher, of course, I have to immediately say that there are many different forms of Christianity, and we don't necessarily do we want to necessarily pick fights with all the Christians at the same time? I'm not so sure. Again, in my philosophical vein, lately I have been evolving towards this position that it's like what most people mean by Marxism is definitely not what I mean by Marxism. So I want to recognize the right of some people to claim that Christianity is something very different from popular Christianity. Was Jesus a Christian? That's a very good question. Was Jesus a Christian? I'm not so sure. Anyway, to stay at this more general meta-psychological level for a little while longer, Lacan eventually forges, partly on the basis of the mirror stage, a distinction between ego, moi, and the subject, sujet. So exactly. So the ego is not the subject. Sujet, a word foreign, a word freighted with philosophical baggage. Lacan knowingly adds this word and its philosophical vocabulary to the analytical discourse, although Freud did not speak of the subject and was wary of philosophy in general, right? So Freud did not use this term, Lacan does. Anyway, so appearances notwithstanding, the ego is, when all is said and done, an inert, fixed bundle of objectified coordinates, a libidinally invested and reified entity. So the ego, when all is said and done, is an inert, so passive, right? Inert, fixed bundle of objectified coordinates, a libidinally invested and reified entity. So reification is this concept very important for Marxists among not just for Marxists, but especially for Marxists. So again, this idea reified, maybe you could say objectified, yes. Anyway, so by contrast with the ego and the illusory sense of fictional selfhood it supports, the psychoanalytic subject of Lacanianism is an unconscious kinetic negativity defying unconscious kinetic negativity. When we say negativity, this is clearly Koryagin reading of Hegel. Defying capture by and within ego level identificatory constructs. So again, subject is an unconscious kinetic negativity defying capture by and within the ego level. The constructs, identified within the ego level. Anyway, so this, it's a very interesting thought. Meditators and mystical traditions will make a lot of it, that there's this surface level of the self which is false and mendacious, but beneath it, not quite consciously, there is a certain seat of agency. I want to sidestep the questions of free will. I think that they are very complicated. I am a committed determinist. I don't believe in free will. I think that free will in general is an incoherent concept. And I think that the right reading of Lacan, or at least the productive reading of Lacan, should not be in terms of free will. So can you have agency without free will? Well, not quite, but maybe to some extent complicated. Definitely you can talk about how there's a deeper mechanism, even if it doesn't really possess ultimate free will. Anyway, I don't want to talk about everything at the same time. Anyway, The Lacanian enunciating subject of the unconscious speaks through the ego while remaining irreducibly distinct through it. So again, so the subject is beneath the ego. To some extent, again, the subject is unconscious, right? Unconscious kinetic negativity. This is what Lacan talks about with respect to the ego. To the subject, which is beneath the ego. Anyway, returning to a tighter focus on the mirror stage proper, Lacan, relying on empirical data from the late 19th and early 20th centuries, posits that very young children between the ages of 6 and 18 months quickly acquire the ability to identify their own images in reflective surfaces. At this time, infants are lacking in most physical and mental abilities possessed by older human beings. Prior to Lacan, Freud already highlights how a biologically dictated prematurational helplessness, German is Hilflosigkeit, naturally predestines the human being to the predominance of social nurture over material nature. So again, so human beings are born, if you want, kind of immature, undetermined by instincts. So, and therefore you have this predominance of social nurture over material nature. Maybe if you want to say hi to Protagoras, who talks about how human children are born weak. Well, Callicles. Let's throw Callicles into the mix as well. That mostly, I mean, there is a human nature, there's a human biological nature, but much more importantly, the cultural milieu defines what we're going to become. Anyway, so this predominance of social nurture over material nature is due to the protracted period of total reliance on other persons over one's life or death vital requirements. Following Freud here, Lacan fleshes out this helplessness into which birth throws neonates, so newborns. So Lacan fleshes out this helplessness into which birth throws newborns, Geworfen, Heideggerian Geworfenheit, describing in detail the anatomical, physiological, cognitive, emotional, and motivational facets of this natural condition of post-birth prematurity. The initial stage of helpless motor impotence and nursling dependence entails the infant experiencing a swirl of negative affects, anxiety, distress, frustration, and so on. To the young child, motivated by these negative affects, a crucial component of the enthralling lure exerted by the fascinating image of his or her body is the image's promise that he or she can overcome this helplessness, this Hilflosigkeit, and be a unified, pulled together whole, an integrated, coordinated totality like the bigger, more mature others he or she sees around him or herself. So again, we talk about this fascinating image of unified, pulled together whole and integrated totality, something that a child sees in the mirror and also sees in other people, right? So however, according to Lacan, individuals spend their entire lives beginning thusly, chasing in vain after an unattainable state of harmony and mastery, first falsely promised by the mirror. So we see this image in the mirror, which is an illusion of our imagination, and throughout the rest of our lives, we chase in vain for this fascinating image of, again, overcoming helplessness, this pulled together whole integrated totality, right? Death of the subject, human beings are fragmented, let's add this, death of the subject, we are, systems, complicated systems, in war, or at least in conflict with oneself, internally. And again, there's this kind of perpetual dissatisfaction, which Lacan, in this is French word épatage, so in this purposefully scandalous manner, Lacan is going to call this castration. Again, pedagogically, not necessarily the best word to use, I feel. This is kind of my question with this kind of over-sexualization, overuse of sexual metaphors, because, I think that Buddha or Heidegger puts they have similar points, but without the use of the sexual metaphor. Same point without the sexual metaphor. And that's a very good question. Is there something really special about sex, or is it just an idiosyncrasy, kind of Lacan's society, this kind of society, repressed French society, of Lacan's kind of repressed French bourgeois society, right? And I actually had this. I have a bunch of notes for myself, right? So this is one of the notes I made to myself. I mean, is it really true? Is sex really the ultimate desire, as Freud would say? Or is it maybe power? Or is it maybe knowledge, as Plato would say? And kind of when we think about Darwin, right? I don't want to. I should talk about this, at some other point, because I think it's an important thought for me. But Darwin would say that, of course, ultimately, kind of the name of the game is survival and reproduction, and in an important sense, survival is reproduction. Survival is just reproduction of yourself into the future through homeostatic processes, right? So the name of the game is survival, which is reproduction, right? So to survive means to reproduce homeostatically, to reproduce yourself into the future, and to reproduction means the survival of the genetic lineage. So survival is reproduction in an important respect. Anyway, so yeah, but so ultimately, all motivation ultimately has to be motivation through the survival or reproduction. But does it have to be explicitly sexual? Not necessarily. And here's where I feel that there's maybe a bit too much epatage in psychoanalytic tradition in general. I mean, I'm not saying sex is not important. Sex is very important psychologically, I think, for human beings. But is it really that singularly important? And are these metaphors, again, Buddha would say that life is dukkha, life is suffering. And a very similar point is put by Lacan by saying that, we're all castrated. But again, Buddha uses a neutral word, including sex. Because, of course, sexual passions are important passions to be aware of in Buddhism, right? And to, engage with, in an important, productive or constructive sense with Buddhism, right? It's one of those passions that leads human beings to be attached and to become unhappy and to do things which ultimately make oneself unhappy and make other people unhappy around them, right? So again, this dukkha, right? So lack of sexual satisfaction and sexual drive is part of dukkha for Buddha in a very straightforward sense. And again, it's interesting how the story of the Buddha, right? It talks about how before Buddha became the Buddha, and while he was an Indian prince, Siddhartha Gautama, right? He had 84,000 concubines. 84,000 concubines. So sex was very much a part of this, of the story. Again, this idea that even though he was completely sexually satisfied, as much sexually satisfied as it is physically possible to be satisfied, 84,000 concubines, right? But at the same time, he still realized that life is suffering or life is unsatisfactory in a deep sense, passivity, unsatisfactoriness. Again, the Sanskrit word is dukkha for Buddha. Or another issue is a similar related note. Buddha had a wife and a child, right? So this is also another important expression of sexual gratification. And he had a wife who was appropriate. He had a wife who was beautiful, whom he loved. And in ancient societies, not a given. They had a male child who survived the illnesses of early childhood. Again, paleontologists tell me that 2/3 of children died before reaching the age of maturity in ancient times. So a very high chance that a child would die or that the mother would die in childbirth, right? So and Buddha skirted all of those issues, and still he realized that life is dukkha. Anyway, that's a broader point. And again, I feel that a good reading of Lacan understands that, when he talks about phallus or he talks about castration, Lacan uses these words metaphorically. When he says we're all castrated, right, he uses this metaphorically. Again, talking, by the way, about both males and females. But pedagogically speaking, I understand that as a PR tactic, as a way to sell your product, Lacan is very successful here. He's partly fashionable, I think, for the wrong reason, that people are just lured by his clever use of terminology. But kind of at the end of the day, I'm not sure if pedagogically these are the best words to use. But again, this is work in progress. So all of this with a question mark. I'm not necessarily saying that Lacan is wrong. Maybe I'll change my mind in the future. Anyway, let's go back to the text. So this imago gestalt of virtual wholeness, identified with by the infant in a jubilant moment of aha, lays down the imagistic nucleus of the thereafter ontogenically accreting ego as a series of self-objectifications in images, and soon after with the event of language acquisition. Words too. Well, anyway, he just talks about how the image in the mirror is a symbol, right? So this is the symbolic is we talk about the imaginary and the symbolic. So we have the images, the imaginary images, and then the symbolic words. Anyway, for Lacan, again, so think back to the three registers: the real, the symbolic, and the imaginary. Anyway, for Lacan, identification with this imago gestalt of the moi, of the ego, right? Moi is just moi. In French, ich in German are the words that respectively Lacan and Freud use for this. In English language, usually we use the word ego. Anyway, so this identification, or you could say misidentification, right? Because this is not a real, it's a misidentification, right? With the imago gestalt of the moi entails alienation. Say hi to Hegel, say hi to Marx. And this, for the additional reasons, should I add Hegel? I don't know. Let's add Hegel just for fun. This for additional reasons over and above those given in the preceding paragraphs. Already in the 1949 Écrit on the mirror stage, mention is made of some prop, human or artificial, supporting the infant as he or she gazes into the mirror and looks at him or herself. In 1949, Lacan seems to think of this prop more as artificial than human, referring to the tot bébé walker leaned on by the child. But in the subsequent revisitations of the mirror stage during the 1960s, Lacan dramatically highlights the supporting role of fellow human beings instead. Supporting role of fellow human beings. The desire is the desire of an other, right? This kind of social nature. Say hi to Aristotle. Say hi to Hegel also. And again, we're talking about the desire, or my desire, right? Is the desire of another. Is the desire of an other. So other human beings play a very important role in this identification. I don't just see myself in the mirror, but other people also point, again, when I'm a child, the child doesn't only see itself in the mirror, but others point to it in the mirror and kind of alert child's attention. Look, it's you. Well, actually, we're going to talk about this in a second. In so doing, Lacan argues that the infant is encouraged to identify with the mirror image as me by verbal and gestural prompts issuing from the bigger others, holding him or her up in front of the reflective surface. For example, the utterance, "That's you there," accompanied by pointing and grinning. This latter shift of emphasis has two crucial consequences. First, the imaginary register of the mirror does not precede the symbolic register of language. So basically you have imaginary and symbolic coming at the same time. The imaginary does not precede the symbolic in a linear chronology of developmental stages, right? If anything, sociolinguistic variables, for instance, the words and body language of parents, are the causal triggers of the child's investment in select sensual perceptual experiences, such as the body image in the mirror, right? And so all of this is contrary to the earlier text. So the earlier text of the mirror stage, the earlier kind of lost or unpublished text of the mirror stage, might be at risk of suggesting. So there's a risk of thinking that the imaginary comes before the symbolic, but again, Lacan's point is no. Imaginary and symbolic come at the same time. Imaginary and symbolic at the same time. During the mirror stage. the mirror stage. Because again, in some sense, that's kind of the whole point, that the mirror stage, the image in the mirror, let me write this explicitly, the image in the mirror is both an imaginary, illusory image and a symbolic, a symbol, a symbolic sign, if you want. I hope this makes sense. Anyway, second, this means that the imagistic nucleus of the ego is suffused from the get-go with the destinal discourse of the other. Well, it's like discourse of the other is basically the symbolic order of society, the symbolic order, which is the social order. In this case, fateful significations in Lacanese, unary traits, this complicated term. So, fateful significations coming from caregivers, fateful significations coming from caregivers' narratives, articulated simultaneously along with their encouragement to the child to recognize him or herself in the mirror. What a handsome boy, what a beautiful girl. You're going to grow up to be big and strong just like your daddy, etc., etc. So again, I made this point. So it's, again, the image in the mirror is the child identifying with the image in the mirror is both kind of, this process both unfolds in the imaginary realm and in the symbolic realm. The mirror, the image in the mirror is at the same time an imaginary illusion and a symbolic, I should write this with a capital S, and a symbolic sign. Again, talking back about the three registers theory that we dealt with in the previous segment. Okay. As a result of all of the above, Lacan considers the recognition that happens in the mirror stage to amount to misrecognition. Yeah, this is what I mentioned when we began this. Basically, couple moments ago, that this is not a real recognition in the mirror. The child recognizes itself in the mirror, doesn't really recognize, but misrecognizes, and misconstrue. It's an illusion. It's both an imaginary illusion and this kind of symbolic misreference, if you want. The sign that doesn't point to the real. So again, it's both an imaginary illusion, and in terms of the sign, kind of the sign of the image in the mirror does not point or does not refer to me, to what? To what I really am, to whatever. What is I? I am a complex, complex system. Does not refer to kind of any real child, to me as I really am. Why? Because I am a complex system. I am a complex system at war with itself. Complex system at war with itself, with myself, if you want. And also, remember, we just talked about how the ego, among other things, is not the subject, sujet. The moi is not the sujet for Lacan. Anyway, this likewise holds throughout life for all ensuing experiences of recognizing, or actually misrecognizing oneself as being a particular kind of I, namely taking imagining oneself to be a certain sort of ego level self. So again, this misrecognition of the ego as the subject. I'm running ahead of the train constantly. With regards to Freudian Lacanian psychoanalysis, it always pays to remember William Wordsworth's line, "The child is the father of a man." Okay. I'm not sure if I can comment on this in a meaningful sense. Let's continue. The ego is not only a congealed heteronymous. Oh, this is a very important word. The ego is not only a congealed heteronymous object. Heteronymous just means, heteronymous literally means external law. So forced from without. Forced from without. This is what heteronymous means. autonomous. Heteronymous is, not autonomous. So not autonomous. So the ego is not only a congealed heteronymous object, rather than this fluid autonomous subject. So heteronymous object again. And here we see object rather than subject. Not a heteronymous object, but an autonomous subject. You see, I'm constantly running ahead of the train. But in its very origins, a repository for the projected desires and fantasies of larger others. Other people, first and foremost. We're talking about culture. The child's image is a receptacle for his or her parents' dreams and wishes, with his or her body image being always already. Always already is an important phrase I like, Heideggerian phrase. Always already overwritten by signifiers flowing from the libidinal economies of other speaking beings. So basically, again, the child's image is a receptacle for parents' dreams and wishes, and it's also always already overwritten by signifiers, basically words or narratives or discourses flowing from the libidinal economies of just in general of other human beings and from culture, human culture in general. Again, this kind of Lacan, like Nietzsche, like Foucault, like Callicles, let's write like Foucault, kind of thematizes this kind of coercive genealogy of personhood, of personhood, since the time, since its inception in childhood, again, this notion how society gets under our skin. Society gets under our skin. And doesn't just get under our skin, but insidiously. Society insidiously. Wow, I can't spell this time of day. Insidiously gets under our skin. Yes. So, hence, recognizing the ego as me, as embodying and representing an authentic, private, unique selfhood that is most genuinely my own, is tantamount to misrecognizing that, at the root, the ego is ultimately an alienating, foreign, introject, introject through which I am seduced and subjected by others, conscious and unconscious wants and machinations. An important phrase, let's repeat it. So this fundamental error, right, of misrecognizing myself in the mirror, right, as embodying and representing an authentic, private, unique selfhood that is most genuinely my own, this error in misrecognition is tantamount to misrecognizing that at the root, forgetting that at the root, the ego is ultimately an alienating, foreign, introject, foreign, external, coercive introject, through which I am seduced and subjected. Subjectified, Foucault might have said. Seduced and subjected by others, conscious and unconscious wants and machinations. Very important phrase. To borrow one of Lacan's many neologisms, the ego is ultimately is something extimate. That is to say, intimately exterior or internal externality, insofar as it crystallizes the desire of the other. The desire of the other, again, we're talking about, desires of other people, first and foremost. We're talking about society. Society, getting inside of our own head. Meaning others' conscious and unconscious wants and machinations. Or, as the Lacan of the 11th Seminar would put it, there's something in me more than me itself, to the extent that this moi essentially is a coagulation of the intersubjective and transsubjective alien influences. So, again, how, compared to Rousseau, talk about this, amour de soi-même, amour propre, compare Rousseau's amour propre. Again, this idea of this, false, misrecognizing oneself as this false, as this false, image, ego, construct that is from the very beginning, that is from the very beginning, kind of a product of others, right? From the very beginning, kind of, infiltrated by external coercive. They use the word machinations. Let's use the word machinations. Machinations. Conscious and unconscious machinations. Again, I'm talking about Rousseau's Amour Propre. I think this is a very important, this is a very appropriate reference. Anyway, so finally, Lacan's utilization of the idea of the mirror is not exclusively literal. Although he often talks of mirrors as shiny reflective surfaces, he does not limit mirroring to being a visible physical phenomenon alone. Most importantly, other persons, speech, gestures, postures, moods, facial expressions, and so on, frequently can be said to mirror back to one an image of oneself, namely a conveyed sense of how one appears from other perspectives. So we're talking about literal mirrors, but also all sorts of mechanisms in which I see my own reflection in the actions of other people. But also all sorts of mechanisms through which I see myself reflected in other people's gestures, actions, whatever. Let's say actions. Okay, and that's the end of the section. I think a very important section. I hope you've enjoyed it. I hope you learned something. Tune back for more. Next time, we're going to continue with otherness, Oedipus complex, and sexuation. That's it from me. Feel free to ask any questions or make any comments. Those are always extremely welcome. I've already received a bunch of very good questions and comments. I'll try to address them in a Q&A. Hopefully we'll do a live Q&A, hopefully this week. I remind you that the easiest way to talk to me these days is through Telegram, or feel free to write through YouTube as well. I try to read all the, I always read and respond to all the comments, at least at this stage, or at least I try to. Anyway, that's it from me. Again, I hope you learned something. I hope this was useful. And until next time, colleagues, stay safe and take care.